With that, any other housekeeping before we start? Okay. Well, I'm Christine O'Connor. I'm co-chair of INC's Zoning and Planning Committee with Ian Tafoya. And today we have two interesting topics. One is the citywide ADU project, and one is metro districts. So we're going to start first with Josh Palmeri from the city, senior city planner, who is working on this fairly new committee to look at ADU solutions throughout the city. So Josh, there you go. We see your screen. Thank you.
Yeah, looks good.
And welcome.
All right. Yeah, thanks for having me. I've got a brief bit of slides here, about 25 slides to go through quickly, but really want to get into the discussion and hear some of your questions. So thanks for having me. Thanks for that introduction. I'm Josh Palmeri, senior city planner. And this is the ADUs in Denver project. Just to be really clear to start off, we just want to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about. When we say ADUs, they are accessory dwelling units. They are not a separate property, a separate parcel that could be sold off separate to the main house. It is a self-contained living space that often folks call things like a granny flat or a backyard casita. They can be attached or detached, so it can be a separate structure like a garage unit, or it could be in addition to an existing house. It could also be a loft or a basement. But the main goal here, the main idea is that it's always accessory to a primary single dwelling unit use currently. We do define them quite clearly in the zoning code. You can look up that definition if you're more interested, but just highlighting some facts here that are important. The idea that it has to be on the same zone lot as a primary single unit dwelling use. And an ADU is also defined as an accessory use. So we can go into more detail what that means in the code, but it's important to know that distinction, that it is a use that is granted to the property, to the zone lot, but only in association with an existing primary dwelling use. We also want to be clear about what is not in the scope of this project. So this project is not technically rezoning any properties citywide. We have a lot of discussion like, is this going to change the zoning in the entire city so everyone can build an ADU? And we've heard pretty clearly the political will is not quite there yet to change the zoning citywide. We do have that recommendation in Blueprint Denver. That's land use recommendation number 4, which says ADUs should be allowed citywide. But until then, people are still following the process of individually rezoning their process or going through their individual city council office in order to do so. We've seen some of the latest examples are Councilman Herndon and Councilwoman Sawyer collaboratively rezoned most of the neighborhood of East Colfax, which I think was about 3,000 properties, to allow ADUs there. And that came out of the NPI, one of the neighborhood planning processes. And so within that neighborhood plan, we heard pretty clearly that folks were interested in allowing ADUs. And so we're continuing to let that process evolve and let those decisions be made locally. So what exactly is in this project? We are implementing land use recommendation number 5 from Blueprint Denver 2019, which says to remove barriers to constructing accessory dwelling units, but also create context-sensitive building form standards. There's some bullet points there that describe that in more detail. Some of these will come later as far as implementing the process later on, but in plain language, what that means is we're trying to remove barriers so that ADUs can be easier to build, but to make sure they also fit into different types of neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods that haven't traditionally seen ADUs, like suburban context neighborhoods where the lot sizes are much greater and traditionally there's not an alley to access the rear of the property. We're going to look closely at what that means, what those ADUs should look like in that context. And so the outcome of this project will be amendments to the Denver zoning code. We will essentially change the rules of what you can build as an ADU. which dictates the size, shape, and location of those additional units. So, why are we doing this work? We know that the way people are living has changed, especially in the past 2 years with the work from home scenarios, COVID. Everyone's looking for a little bit more flexibility on their property. There's also a lot more interest in housing additional family members, and folks are looking for, different spaces for in-laws or expanded family arrangements and things like that. And so we think this is a decent way to add some gentle density, add some flexibility to folks' property, but also figure out a way to help them kind of stay in place and age in place as their property changes, as prices go up and people are looking for new and innovative solutions. We also think it's a really great anti-displacement strategy, that it's a way for folks to reinvest in their property. It's a good way for folks to remain and prosper in their neighborhoods. We hear a lot of fear about, taxes going up, the neighborhood becoming more and more expensive, people that have traditionally lived in these neighborhoods being priced out, or their rent increases change. And so we're hoping that ADUs can open up a little bit more of those housing options to possibly provide a unit that doesn't exist in some of these neighborhoods, like 1 and 2 bedroom homes that potentially are harder to find in more established neighborhoods. There's lots of benefits to ADUs. I mean, here's just one: that the cost of land has gone up tremendously in the past, decade in Denver. We're close to $100 a square foot for property. The smallest parcels in Denver are selling for $250,000. And so we're really reaching a point where it's hard to gain access into the market, and it's very difficult to do so through any form of new construction. ADUs are smaller, they're limited in size, so there's some naturally occurring affordability there. You can only rent a 650 square foot unit out for so much, right? There's limits to what could be charged for that. And traditionally, an ADU is built and owned and maintained by the existing property owner. We're not seeing a lot of scrapes and replaces where developers are trying to add an ADU. They're only allowed in certain districts, and so there's a lot more interest of people becoming their own on-site sort of landlord. We also know that the interest in ADUs are growing. We've seen an uptick since 2010, since we sort of re-legalized them across Denver. They've been growing, and we have recommendations. In 2019, we adopted that policy that says they should be expanded or should be allowed citywide. And so we are getting more applications coming in, more interest in different neighborhoods, especially in places like suburban neighborhoods and further out where they weren't previously recommended prior to 2019. We did see a small blip in 2020, COVID they tapered off for a bit, but we're seeing that uptick continue through last year and beginning through this year. We also know that, Denver is still very popular. Denver is poised to grow by, roughly another 100,000, 150,000 people in the next 20 years. And so we're looking for citywide solutions to help absorb some of this growth. We think ADUs can just be one small piece of that puzzle. And we're also, still in this housing crisis. We've all seen the headlines, I imagine, at this point. I think the latest article that came out 2 weeks ago was that Denver's the 5th most expensive city in the country, only behind places like San Francisco and LA and Miami. And so, we need some solutions. We think ADUs are just one piece of that puzzle. It's not going to obviously solve the housing crisis, but we'd love to do whatever we can in a gentle and contextual way. We also know that ADUs are a large part of Denver. They've been around since, Denver started. There's a great example here of the previously named Sheedy Mansion at 11th and Grant that has its associated, then sort of carriage house, but essentially an early ADU. And you can see it's still in existence today. I think as the city has grown and the uses have changed, it's become, more of like a law office or a bed and breakfast and things like that. But you can look in a lot of our other historic neighborhoods, a lot of older Places like Baker, Curtis Park, Platt Park, they have a lot of examples of alley-loaded accessory structures that have been here since, you know, the late 1800s. So here's the map of where ADUs are currently allowed throughout the city. Technically, ADUs are allowed in any zone district that is 2-unit or greater. So that is to say, if you could build a duplex there or a row home, you can have an ADU there, but you may only have an ADU in association with a single unit structure. So if you happen to live in that higher intensity zone district, you can have an ADU. But, you know, the map is misleading. You'll see that the entire downtown Denver is lit up here as it's allowing ADUs, but that is to say, you could build an ADU on the 16th Street Mall if you had a single family house there, but we know that that's not the reality. That's not the case. That's not where people are wanting to build ADUs. And so the more accurate map would be something like this, where we're looking at just at single unit zoned areas of the city. So everything in blue is where the city is currently zoned for single unit only. It's, you know, your traditional neighborhoods. And then in sort of the yellow, the cream color is the only places in the city where we actually allow ADUs in those single unit districts. So it's about 10 to 12% of our entire single unit districts that currently are allowing ADUs. Here's a map of where we've seen ADUs built since 2010. We've only seen about 400 permits for ADUs citywide. That includes attached and detached structures. So this doesn't distinguish between the two. So these could be a basement unit that you'll never see, or it could be a garage pop top scenario. But you'll see there's concentrations here where they're popping up, you know, where they were allowed back in 2010, where we opened up the ability to actually build them. But in current years, since 2010, we are seeing that more interest in other areas of town. And you can see the dots are beginning to spread out from the center of the city. ADUs are regulated just like any other building form. So similar to building a garage on your property, we have rules about height, square footage, setbacks, how close it could be to your property, to your neighbor's property, to the rear. But we also have things like building footprint maximum and also a square footage limitation maximum. The accessory dwelling use is limited by square footage based on your lot size. So there's 3 tiers of what you could build: a 650 square foot ADU, or an 864 square foot ADU, or a 1,000 square foot ADU on our very largest lots. Some other basic sort of use descriptions, definitions of ADUs is that in order to have the accessory dwelling unit use in a single unit district, the property owner must live on that property. It must be their permanent and legal residence. And so you must get mail there, have voter registration, and spend most of your year there. So you're not allowed to own a property that you do not live on and also have an accessory dwelling unit use associated with it. In doing so, when you live on the property, when you live there in your primary home, you can have an ADU. And because the ADU is an extension of your own home, you may also rent it out as a short-term rental or a long-term rental. But this sort of use ownership requirement does prevent that sort of distant landlord scenario where someone doesn't live there, isn't maintaining the property, and is trying to either short-term rent it out or potentially rent to essentially 2 dwelling units. So these ownership requirements prevent that. Some of the barriers that we've heard about throughout the process that we're exploring are things like those size limitations. We want to know if those are right. Are we actually preventing good outcomes by not allowing maybe potentially more ADU, something that could be a little bit more affordable by price per square footage? Height restrictions. We have a 1.5 story limitation, which actually, unfortunately, sometimes forces people to build a larger ground floor garage than they would like to, because it means that your upper story can only be 75% of your lower story. It gets a little technical and the rules are difficult, but that often means that you have to build a bigger structure. We're kind of forcing people to build a larger footprint than they might like to. And so we really want to look at if that's getting in the way. Is that increasing the cost of construction? Is it increasing some of those design options? There's also issues with reusing of existing structures. We'd love to allow people to do the right thing, sustainably use an existing garage, but currently the zoning says that if the existing structure does not meet all of the existing setbacks, so it's the building's not in the exact right place, you're not allowed to reuse it. And so we'd love to look closely at that and see what we can modify. And we also know that in the suburban context, we don't have the appropriate zone districts to zone into, since traditionally there weren't ADUs there. We don't have enough zone districts for certain lot sizes. So we need to create some of those districts and figure out what can and should be built as an ADU in those districts. So yeah, speaking of those contexts, the city is roughly broken down into three main contexts for single unit residential places. There's urban edge, and suburban. We're seeing most of our urban areas already allowing ADUs in a lot of ways, but not quite there yet. We're seeing interest, as I mentioned, in the suburban context. And so we really want to look at what that means. What should a suburban ADU look like when there's not an alley, but you do have potentially a driveway, you do have a cul-de-sac, or unique site conditions. But we also want to compare that to what can be built today on those suburban lots. So someone could potentially tear down an existing structure and build a much larger primary house that could take up the entire yard, and they could also add up to a 1,000 square foot garage. That's the allowance citywide. And so we really want to compare and contrast, what's the difference when it's an ADU, when it's not. And so we would prefer folks to help us figure out what an ADU looks like that they would prefer to see, rather than sort of a scrape and replace of the primary structure. So currently we are coming up to our third advisory committee meeting. We are meeting monthly. We've got an advisory committee comprised of many industry folks, nonprofit organizations. We're talking closely with like Habitat for Humanity. They're building lots of them. We've got architects and builders, but also just regular neighborhood advocates from all corners of the city. So we've got a very diverse and well-educated group of folks. And we just got started in March. And so we're currently in the exploring of the issues phase, and we'll be moving on to evaluating some of those alternatives. And then eventually later down in the year, recommending a strategy to City Council, developing those tools. And we're hoping for complete adoption sometime in early 2023. Some of those issues that we're currently exploring with the committee, we've heard a lot about these major kind of buckets of issues, so things that fall under impact to the neighbors and impact to the community, things like parking and privacy, neighborhood fit, making sure that ADUs do actually fit well into the neighborhood, to the architectural patterns that exist there, and concerns about displacement. We're looking closely at design, construction, and buildability. How hard is it to, design and build something that is feasible, that makes sense, that is cost effective? But looking at some of those building form issues, lot size issues, we'd love to get all of the zoning barriers out of the way that we can. We also want to know about cost and affordability. How can we actually bring down the cost of construction? While we can't actually change the cost of lumber or labor, but we can look at what zoning is doing to actually, unfortunately, increase those costs. And so also looking at, how we can figure out a way to bring some more affordability to them, the cost of rent. We'd love to work with other departments, host and continue to work closely with the WDRC, who's helping property owners build ADUs with low-cost loans and things like that. And then looking really closely at those uses and use allowances, how the ADU will be used. We are also tasked with allowing ADUs to be accessory to more than single unit buildings. So looking at what it would look like when an ADU is allowed with a duplex or with a row home. and also looking at some of those ownership requirements, and also visiting short-term rental issues and any other concerns that come up from there. We're also looking closely at other cities. We've talked with Portland, Seattle, places that are well ahead of our timeline. I think we're approximately like 20 years behind Portland's development of ADUs. And so they've got a lot of good tips, and they recommend that we should not discriminate against ADUs by imposing any more rules on ADUs than you would on any other building form. So something to really consider as we move through the process. We also have quite a bit of community outreach opportunities. There's a comment form on our website that's always up. You can visit the website at adusindenver.com. But we're also putting out a public survey coming up in May. So we're going to get a little bit more feedback from the public. We'll share that in our newsletters. It'll be on the website. And so we'd love to hear from everyone what they think the issues are. I want to hear more about those concerns before we start to move into that alternative phase. We will have focus groups that folks can sign up for specific topics, like looking at the architectural issues, things like that. More of those suburban context issues, maybe in a little bit more detail. So all that information is also on the website, and there's sign up sheets there. And so, yeah, that's more or less all I have here. But just to close out, let's just remember that we are tasked with removing barriers. So we're hoping not to, impose any new barriers onto ADUs. They're already costly and a bit restrictive to build. And so we do want to remove those barriers, but we also want to make sure that they do fit the contexts of different neighborhoods throughout the city, make sure that the ADU in the suburban context is appropriate, as well as make sure that they're still appropriate in the urban and urban edge contexts. And so please do visit the website for more information. Our advisory committee list is there. You can see who all is on it and where we are in the process. The recordings of our previous 2 meetings are on there. The videos are there with the meeting summaries and notes, and you can follow along. They are public meetings, and so there's also a place to sign up for our Zoom meetings for the upcoming meeting, which will be the first week of May. But with that, I think, we should open it up for questions. And
okay, there's a question that's already been answered, but I'm going to read it. If a resident applies for a zoning change to allow an ADU, is it necessary to have a neighbor's agreement? And somebody said they've done it and it's not necessary. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't think it's a necessary requirement, but it is something that the planning board and city council will weigh in their decision. They are the ultimate votes to decide. And so they do, weigh community input as far as approving or not approving the rezoning. But yeah, as far as we are concerned, the citywide sort of guidance, the Blueprint Denver guidance is quite clear that ADUs should be allowed in all residential zone districts in all bits of the city. And so
I'm going to go to Katie Fisher next.
Hi there. This is Katie Fisher. With this new task force, are we also going to look at the retro look, or I shouldn't say look, the retro ADUs that already exist? I'm in the University of Denver neighborhood, and we have a lot of old, I believe they were once single car garages that have been changed over to ADUs, probably done after World War II. Would these rules and regulations apply to them?
Yeah, it's a good question. They would not. If something is built and it's legally permitted and isn't existing as a structure, we're not going back and imposing any new rules on something that's currently inhabited and in use. We're not, that's the old term, is that it's grandfathered in, it's grandmothered in a way. So those structures will be allowed to remain and exist in their current state, unless for whatever reason it was illegally built and unpermitted. Then it would cause a potential life and safety hazard.
Yeah, it's the safety issue. Most of these are in terrible shape. The people seem to put money into the main unit, and then this additional unit are really unsafe and a problem. So, but thanks for your answer.
As a follow-up, there's a question in the chat. Are garage conversions considered ADUs? And I guess that's both old ones and going forward.
Yes, yeah. I mean, if you were to convert your garage into a dwelling unit, it would be considered an accessory dwelling unit. Yeah. If you put in a kitchen or bathroom, those living quarters that, you know, actually someone wants to live in, it would be considered an accessory dwelling unit. You would have to permit it as such, and you would have to follow all of the, you know, modern building codes. You have to bring it up to our life and safety standards. So oftentimes we find that it's quite difficult. The foundation, the slab isn't insulated, or, you know, the structure might have some integrity issues. And so we often see that, unfortunately, folks have to essentially scrape the garage and start anew in order to get that proper foundation infrastructure, fire code requirements and things like that. But we're looking closely at what that means and what we can do on the building code side. But building code is much more difficult to change than the zoning code. So.
Okay, there's a couple more questions. Are ADUs required to be tied into the grid separately, or can they pull power and water from the primary house? And are compost toilets, whoops, hold on. Are composting toilets allowed in the absence of tying into the public sewer system?
Yeah, good question. We do recommend through zoning that you do share utilities where you can. Ideally, we would like to make it easier to tap into existing infrastructure and things like that, including the existing sewer taps. I think it's kind of up to Denver Water whether they require a new tap or not. It's kind of site by site based, but I think they're getting better at allowing those shared utilities. Composting toilet, I think, yeah, that's a tricky one. I'm not quite sure that that's currently allowed in building code. I think you are still required to have a sewer tap, and it's still quite difficult to prove out some of the, you know, sanitary issues around that, I think, in the eyes of the building code.
Okay, if I heard you right, you're still working on or considering that issue, and you're still working on allowing ADUs to tie in to utilities in the house. Those things are still in flux. Am I correct?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's a bit up to the property owner as well, depending on how you'd like to use the ADU. You know, some people want to separate their utilities if they're having a long-term tenant that they want to sort of, you know, have them cover the bills for whatever reason. But yeah, we're seeing a variety. There's nothing that is in the zoning code that requires or forces otherwise. And so
okay,
it's a bit of an option.
I'll get back to the questions in the chat, but David Pardo, I'm sorry, I did see your hand. You want to go?
Yeah, I have a few relatively short questions. The first is, I know that lots of people have done ADU rezones throughout the city. And, you know, each one is its own process other than when they do full neighborhood rezones all at once. Has any ADU rezone from, let's say, USUB to USUB1 ever not passed once it got to, at least once it got to the planning board stage, and not just somebody thought about it and talked to CPD?
It's a good question. We have not seen any ADUs denied in the urban context to date. We have seen one ADU denied in the suburban context. And that's due to issues with sort of that contextual piece. I think some of the council members or community is concerned that the ADU rules that are currently on the books, they're the same standards citywide. And so there's concern that that's not quite yet appropriate in a suburban context. And so I think that's the only real denial that we've seen. I mean, the plan guidance is quite clear, and so we're working to do what we can to make them allowed and make them easily approvable.
Got it. So does that mean that at some point in the not too distant future, as part of this process, you guys will come up with potentially like different guidelines specific to the suburban context?
You got it. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, technically we'll be changing the zoning regulations. So it's not a design guideline, but yeah, you're essentially saying the rules will change. We'll figure out what height is appropriate in the suburban context, or how wide could it be, how tall, what square footage. That's exactly right.
Cool. And then I've had the chat open and there's one question. If the city's so in favor of allowing this, what actually has been done about neighborhood outreach? For anybody who doesn't know, they did neighborhood outreach. Specifically, Zillow did neighborhood outreach. They don't build anything, but they have a pretty big market research department. 73% of Denver is in favor of ADUs everywhere. And also of note, 63% of Denver is in favor of duplexes and triplexes everywhere. So with that, keep moving on. Thanks for the answer.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try, let's see. You mentioned the owner must live at the location with the ADU. The owner must be present on the property and the property cannot be split. How will that be handled when the property is sold? And then I sort of had a follow-up to that. You can include, can someone who's flipping a house construct an ADU while they're doing the flipping on the first primary?
Yeah, this is a good question. This is one of those issues under the use requirements that we're currently contending with. Your question about when the property is sold, you would have to, or you would be forced to essentially sell your property is the issue we're coming against. So say, someone lives in a property in a neighborhood they love, they build an ADU, they live there for a few years, and then they fall in love and move in with their partner across town. They would essentially be forced to either sell that property or decommission the accessory dwelling unit, which goes against a lot of other, citywide policies. I mean, we're essentially removing a housing unit from the market. You would have to remove either like the gas line or some of the plumbing. You would have to disconnect some of those things to where the accessory dwelling use no longer exists on that property. And so, yeah, that's something that we're looking at closely, whether or not we should be, doing that, forcing people to sell their property or unload some of their assets in that way. It's a fine line between, allowing that condition, but also trying to ward off sort of this idea of speculative development where someone could flip a house and add an ADU. Christine, to answer your question, currently you would not be able to do that because you do have to be the primary and permanent residence there. You would have to, flipper would have to buy that property, establish actual permanent residence on that property, and then build the ADU, and then potentially you could sell it. So once the ADU is built with the primary house, you could sell that full property, but then that use and that allowance is transferred to the new owner, and that new owner must still fulfill that requirement of permanent residence.
The next question, David Pardo gave his input on a Zillow survey, but if you have anything to add, I'd like to see city data. If the city is so in favor of allowing ADUs in areas previously not allowed, why aren't you basically zoning every neighborhood? And what is being done to see if residents in each neighborhood are actually in favor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of that outreach was done for Blueprint Denver. So that's how we got to that sort of recommendation and then adoption of that language in 2019. And so that was part of the citywide, 2 or 3 year outreach process of Blueprint that led to the recommended language that they should be allowed, but it didn't implement and say that we are rezoning the entire city. It has a little bit more language in there that we should look more closely at doing small areas of town. That I don't think the political will was there in 2019 either to start that process. And so it's been, sort of decided that we should do it.
I would like to see the data from Blueprint because that's very evasive. I mean, you saw yellow stickies on a lot of things, but I never saw data by neighborhood on ADUs. And I don't have a dog in this game, in this race, because I live in a lot that doesn't have room, but I think, And let's see. Okay, I'm going to go to one from Bill Tanner, and then I'll do Gertie. If I want to create an apartment within the main house and I have a spare basement room and bathroom, can I rent as an apartment? And how is that different from an ADU in terms of policy?
Oh, yeah, it's a good question. So, today you're allowed to rent out any room in your house as if, you had a roommate. If you're talking about an apartment with an actual separate kitchen and bathroom, that's where the accessory sort of use, the additional dwelling unit comes into play. Once you sort of define and establish a separate unit with cooking and sleeping and sanitary quarters, that's when the definition of an accessory dwelling unit kicks in, and it should be permitted as such. And so, the city, we want to inspect to make sure that you've got everything up to code and that it is a safe, a habitable basement for someone to actually reside in.
Okay, I'm going to go a little out of order here, just because Jeff has a comment on the last question and he has his hand up. Jeff, could you quickly ask that? And then I'll go back to the order. Can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Mhm.
Okay, I had asked about the outreach portion of this to find out what the residents think. It seems like the whole ADU process is just being forced on us, that people in government have decided that, in their opinion, this is a good approach to solving what may or may not be problems that are real in every area or some areas. Is the city in the business of hiring Zillow to do its outreach work, or should it do it on its own? Nobody I know was contacted by Zillow to find out how they feel about ADUs, and I don't think we should rely on a company who completely failed in the fix and flip business and is almost on the verge of bankruptcy to be doing our work for us.
Yeah, it's a great point. We are not. We private Zillows. That's their own private survey. We have no affiliation with their polling and whatever they're doing for outreach. Our outreach was done through the Blueprint Denver process, and our outreach is still being done whenever these potential legislative rezonings are being brought forth. And so, in the case of the let's say like the East Colfax neighborhood rezoning that was just adopted a couple of months ago, there was a whole year-long process, outreach process through the council offices where they, got signatures from neighbors, made sure there was X amount of property owners that were interested and wanted to fully rezone their property to allow ADUs. And so we are not rezoning any properties through this project. We are simply providing guidance for when ADUs are allowed, what can be built.
Let's pull up this right. I hate to interrupt you here, but that's a completely false statement. Rezoning is exactly what you're doing to allow for ADUs in areas where they are currently not allowed. So that is very, very misleading. Now, I would be in favor if you wanted to rezone our entire neighborhood and do the process like East Colfax and let the chips fall where they may. That's a reasonable approach, but going through the back door and selectively rezoning on a case-by-case basis where you ask and you shall receive, that is a completely flawed approach to and doesn't respect what property owners got when they purchased their lot. When I purchased in this area, I knew I was purchasing in an area that did not allow ADUs. Then comes along Blueprint Denver saying they know best and I need to have them in my neighborhood. I think that is underhanded.
Okay, and I hear you, and I would like the data again. Maybe I'll ask David Gaspers for it because he's pretty responsive if he's still there. But we do need the data that actually asked that question in the Blueprint. Okay, Gertie, you've been waiting, then Joel, and then I'll go back to David, I'm going to skip you and I'm going to go back to the chat. but Gertie?
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for this presentation. Josh, I would like to know what is the difference between an ADU and a tandem house in a neighborhood that is TU?
Yeah, that's a great question. A tandem house is an actual separate parcel and property that can be sold off separately. So you would technically be able to own a tandem house separately from an ADU. It's not tied to a primary structure. A tandem is a second primary structure on a zone lot. So just like a duplex, they're just two detached units, but they are separate parcels and ownership properties. Whereas an ADU is tied to the primary structure, the primary single unit property, and the same owner.
So you wouldn't have to split you would have to split the zone lot though, for if you wanted to sell a tandem house.
Yeah, I mean,
Separately.
it's similar to you don't have to split the zone lot. They exist on one zone lot, similar to a duplex, but it's a separate parcel. It's a separate ownership parcel, if that makes sense.
Sort of. Okay, thanks.
There's some tricky nuance in the zoning code. It's hard to think about a zone lot and a parcel as being a different thing, but in duplex and in row home, technically they are separate things.
But is it at all dependent on the size of the new, in our neighborhood, somebody applied to build the variance came in on, they were trying to build a tandem house on a lot that was deficient about 18 feet or whatever. And what I can't figure out from your answer is, well, is it dependent at all on the size of the tandem unit relative to the primary unit?
Tandem house has a separate set of rules as well. So yeah, there's minimum zone lot sizes to allow that type of development. And so I think you're running into a nuance there about their property was too small to actually meet the zoning code requirement of developing tandem homes. ADUs similarly have requirements for lot sizes. And so in this project, we are going to look at whether that's, an added barrier to developing some of these things. But yeah, different rules for tandem, different rules for ADU, also different rules for duplex. And so there's some nuance in there. I could follow up offline if you want more detail.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Josh, it looks like there may be some questions that we don't get to anyway. So that would be great if we could do some follow-up.
Sure.
We have about 15 more minutes. And we really haven't hit the main question I have, and I see Leslie has it, but let's hear. Joel, do you have a question about this?
Oh, good morning. Hi, Josh. First, just a request. Sometimes in conversations like this, people shorthand the restrictions on ADUs and that the owner must live on site, etc., not remembering to say where the zoning is SU. There are certain restrictions that only apply to SU and don't apply to ADUs generally.
That's right.
But because it becomes tedious to say where the zoning is SU every time, people are left with the impression that ADUs have restrictions, when in fact some of the restrictions are specific to ADUs and SU. So if you could clarify that, just so nobody's left with a misimpression of the current state. And then secondly, a lot of the questions here today and a lot of the questions the task force is getting of people saying, here are barriers to constructing ADUs, are not inherently zoning questions. We've had some of them today that are building code related things. There are questions about utilities, water, power tying together. There's questions of, if I build an ADU, then Dottie's going to make me upgrade all my sidewalks, although they would seem to be entirely separate questions. So my question for you is, in your project, getting all this feedback to real barriers and needless complexity, are you envisioning your project summarizing those and recommending action on those? Or is your project going to say, well, we're really focused on zoning code changes, so thanks for your input, but that's out of our scope? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great point. No, we are hearing lots of feedback about that. And so, yes, we are taking all of those recommendations into consideration. We will be producing internal memos and working closely with other departments to see where we can push and move the needle. There will be, an extended implementation phase after adoption, after obviously the zoning code issues, where we'll continue to have those discussions. And we've heard that, there are recommendations. Dottie has them in some neighborhood plans where they would start to look at the sort of sidewalk encumbrance, some of those issues, and how we can help sort of subsidize folks that are having issues paying for sidewalks, especially on, let's say, corner lots where, you have to buy 2 sidewalks instead of just 1 sidewalk improvement if it doesn't exist. And so, yeah, there's definitely guidance and language there, and we're going to continue to implement those recommendations throughout this project and after. And yes, on the ownership requirement, you're right. The sheet here describes it well. So in single unit districts is where the ownership requirement occurs whenever you're in a higher intensity zone district, like 2 unit, like row home. Those requirements do shift to where you don't exactly have to live on the property. I think the thinking there is that alternatively you could, build a duplex, build a tandem house, as Gertie was mentioning, and have a similar outcome. And so we didn't want to, I suppose, discriminate against ADUs in those zone districts where they occur.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't hear that when you answered, Gertie, but I'm hearing it now. Thank you, Joel, for pointing that out. I'm going to ask Leslie's question and my question. Are there any plans to take a cost reduction program like the Renaissance Collaborative, the West Denver Renaissance Group has been doing? I actually don't believe in my heart that this is an affordability step, because it's so costly to build these. Even the Chaffee Park overlay, when we saw the survey and they asked people what they would build, the number one thing people were building was an extra room for when their in-laws came. These were people who had money to build, and we're going to have it as an extra bedroom space. So I have trouble with the affordability, and I wondered if, addressing my question and Leslie's, you can add to that.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think you're right about, the state of ADUs today, how they will potentially be used only by in-laws. But for us, the city, the housing-wide goals are to expand housing options. And the idea being that in the future, if that family does move out, or 10 years from now they sell that property, the next homeowner is eligible to open that up as a rental property, as in a different living arrangement. So we're really looking at it as more of a long-term solution. It's not going to solve any housing crisis issues today, but it will help. We are adding units, and Denver is currently short, what is it, like 60,000 housing units, and so we've only seen 400 ADUs built to date, so it's not going to absorb that number, but we do think it will help. Are there plans for some kind of cost reduction initiated by the city itself? Yeah, so HOST, our Housing Office of Stability, and they are working closely with WDRC. So they are actually implementing a grant program to where they're helping to subsidize some of those properties. Currently, it's only in West Denver, but they are looking at options to expand that citywide. I think the WDRC program is kind of a pilot for now. There was a certain amount of money allocated to getting, I think, up to 10 ADUs built, and they're allowed to do 4 or 5 outside of their boundaries, West Denver. And so they are looking at definitely expanding those options, and that program is seeing some success to date.
It would be good if you could put the exact name within HOST of the program and the person issuing those grants. So that would be great. Here's a question, a quick question. Is a garage required? Is a garage required with an ADU? And how would the driveway be dealt with in the suburban district where you don't have an alley?
No, a garage is not required. We don't have any off-site parking requirements currently for single unit construction, single unit homes. And so that isn't extended onto the ADU, but we know the market is yielding, differently. Every new house essentially does come with a garage and does come with parking. And, it's based on the need. So we are seeing most of our ADUs built as above garage unit, that version that does provide parking. We do have some allowances in the code. One of the building code coverage standards actually incentivizes parking in a way by writing off 500 square feet when you do provide parking. And so we want to look at things and see if that's a barrier. We're seeing a lot less single story ADUs built because of that, which we would love to see more of them because it is a much more affordable build. So
Could
we've
you
heard.
repeat that? Could you repeat that about writing off 500 feet? I just missed that completely.
Yeah, it's pretty technical. It's an exemption from the zone, your lot coverage. There's lot coverage standards citywide. It's approximately 36% is what you're allowed to cover in most properties. And so when you build a garage, you're allowed to exempt 500 square feet of that build at a maximum of 500 square feet, only when parking is provided, so that current exemption is not extended to a single story accessory dwelling unit, which it's a bit of a philosophical question of what are we prioritizing here? Are we prioritizing parking or are we prioritizing people? And so our committee will look closely at that and figure out if we should extend that allowance to accessory dwelling units or change the numbers. But yeah.
Well, are you going to look at permeability and soil and all that as well at the same time?
Certainly. I mean, we're not going to increase any standard that would make it worse. That exemption is allowed today, and it's allowed only for when parking is provided. And so we're looking at extending that to actual housing and dwelling units versus vehicular storage.
Okay, and Bruce Basket, did that answer your question about how a driveway would be dealt with? I guess you wouldn't need a driveway because you're not requiring it. Is the way the person gets to their ADU is a sidewalk or a path next to the main house in a suburban area?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a lot of great examples. We don't see many of them in Denver, but other cities like Portland, the city of Portland does not have alleys in their residential districts, and they've got great success with ADUs. It's all about, site design, simple path, a simple gateway to walk to the rear of the property or whatever it might be. We've seen a lot of good solutions, and typically in these suburban neighborhoods that they do have quite large driveways where, you can easily store 3, 4, 6 vehicles at times.
And Carl has a question. After 20 years of ADU construction, how much has Portland increased their housing stock via ADUs?
Yeah, it's a good question. We're still working closely. It's difficult to get data from them, from other cities, but that's something that we can look into, finding a little bit more.
So
of those numbers.
That would be great if you could find that. I mean, this is an editorial note, personal for me, but during group living, it was extremely frustrating to hear the planners say that they were doing peer city research, and we never ever could get the exact data. They were just chatting on the phone, getting anecdotes and experience, but we don't get the data here. And that's what I think I heard a couple of people asking for.
Yeah, that's great feedback. Yeah, Portland's tricky because their rules are quite different. They actually allow you to sell off an ADU as a separate property. And so it becomes a bit of a different classification. It becomes kind of a new property in a way, but yeah, certainly can look into what they have available.
Well, for all your peer cities, I would like that information. It's just something
Certainly.
we should have in hand.
Yeah, thank you.
One more, and then, HOA's question. How do ADUs in suburban context overcome limitations placed by HOAs? Can HOAs prohibit ADUs? That's complicated. We may have to let you answer that in writing, but unless you have a quick answer.
That is complicated, I think. I mean, citywide rules are what they are. I think we'd have to have the HOA bylaws clearly looked at, and it comes down to a litigation understanding at that point. It's beyond citywide control. We're allowing what we can allow citywide, and so we're not in the business of writing HOA restrictions.
Okay, well, there's a couple more, but we do have it's 10:30 and we do have another speaker. So I think we're going to wrap up. I will send you the chat
Okay.
and you can offer some additional information, maybe some survey information and help us out there. And I appreciate you coming. I'm glad we're catching this early in the process. We've just started meetings the last 2 months, correct?
That's right.
So I'm just wondering if you have some people represented on the committee who are not in favor of this, or you have mostly advocates, housing advocates, and people who have been advocating for this for a long time. Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah, we have a diverse group of folks. We've got a representative from Montbello, a representative from Harvey Park neighborhood. We've got lots of folks that are concerned and have, contextual issues, and that are, I wouldn't say opposed to ADUs, but are definitely voicing that opinion that there are issues that need to be addressed. And so we also have, I guess, like Rosemary's on the call. Rosemary's a committee member as well. So you can get her perspective if you like.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming. We're going to ask you maybe to come back at the end of the summer. You are going to continue working on this pretty quickly, I have a feeling. So we will ask you to come back. Thank
Definitely.
you, Josh.
Thanks a bunch for having me. Appreciate the feedback.
And before we go to the next speaker, let's see, I'm just going to mute a few people. Okay. And we have a speaker on Metro Districts, Jim Gibson, who's been working on this issue for years and is actually working at the state capitol on a bill right now. He's kind of our go-to guy for all things Metro District, not only in Denver, but statewide. And this is going to be a little tricky. First, can we test your microphone, Jim? Can you say hello and introduce yourself and we make sure it works?
Hello, this is Jim Gibson. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, good sign.
And do you want me to put up the PowerPoint?
Please.
Okay. While you introduce yourself, I'm going to find it again. Give me a minute. I'm going to put myself on mute while I share it.
Let me just give you, while she's doing that, let me give you some background on how I got involved in this issue. I had been, there was an area plan process for the redevelopment of the Loretto Heights campus in Southwest Denver. I was involved as a steering committee member, providing community input on that. Towards the end of that planning process, we had heard pretty much by accident that there was going to be, and this was prior to the rezoning being approved, we had heard that there was going to be a Metro District put on the side of the campus of the Loretto Heights College. And frankly, at that point in time, this is going back well before the pandemic, I had no idea what a Metro District was. I didn't know what its purpose was. And so I just began researching it. And it's been my experience that, especially when there is what we call a dirt district, where there is no, can you get that's not the first slide. Can you do the first slide? When there's a dirt district, meaning there's no infrastructure, no homes, no residents, of course, this is where I think the problems start, because many of the arrangements are set by people who will not actually be residing within the Metro District. It's basically the property owner / developer who is governing, and these Metro Districts are a form of local government. The Metro District Board performs many of the functions of a mayor and a city council. And in the beginning, when there are no residents yet present, because no homes have yet been built, they are making all the governance decisions prior to any residents setting foot put on property. And this is not just a Denver problem, as Christine said, this is a problem across the state, in my view. The developer basically sets the boundaries. In this case, it was Loretta Heights campus. They go to the city. What I've seen here in Denver, as well as across the state, is that city councils routinely approve these metro districts, which authorizes an election to be conducted as to whether the metro district should be created or not. Of course, the only people who are voting at that time are affiliated with the developer. There's no residents there yet. So that's where I think this kind of all starts. Okay, let's start with the first slide. Go ahead, just hit the next button. Just hit your space bar, Christine. Okay, yeah, just hit all of them. These are the table of contents for the presentation, just till you get to policy goals at the end. Okay, great. So I'll be telling you, like, to review what the intended purpose, I think, when the legislature created this authority for local governments to evaluate and potentially approve these new metro districts, what the legislature, I believe, had in mind, and what's been twisted and turned, I think, through some loopholes in the law, as well as developer manipulation, into an unintended purpose. And one of the outcomes from all of that has been really taxation without representation. And I'll get into why that's the case. Why metro districts? Actually, and to be frank about it, why not from the developer's point of view? Metro districts have become an additional profit center to developers. And what I mean by that is that nothing wrong being in the business of building and selling homes at a profit. But I have a personal objection to using a governmental unit as a profit center, and I'll go through how that's actually occurring right now. It's metro district residents who pay the price for what I think are unnecessarily higher property taxes, and also non-metro district residents, those residents who live in the surrounding neighborhoods. They can also pay a price, which I'll get into later in the presentation. And then I'll go over some long-term policy goals that I think need to be addressed. And we actually are taking a small first step in this legislative session to do some, again, I think they're fairly modest reforms that will get us started on the path of unraveling what I consider to be a pretty considerable multi-layered problem. You could do the next slide, please, Christine. I can't hear you because I think you're muted. Okay, just hit the next, and then hit just the space bar. Okay, so this is, I think, what was the intention of the legislature when they created this. This was shortly after World War II when this statute was created, that basically authorized local governments to consider applications for metro districts, which is a form of a special district. There's a number of other types of special districts, but this is just one type of special district. And the idea is that so future district residents could be charged higher property taxes to pay bonds that finance public improvements. Let's say theoretically, I live in Harvey Park, just west of the Loretta Heights campus. Say that I had some great ideas to improve amenities in my neighborhood. The city decided that it didn't want to finance the infrastructure that my ideas would require. So I said, okay, alternatively, since the city has decided they don't want to do that, I could propose a metro district to city council and say, okay, if I get the approval, 50% plus one of the people who live within the boundaries of that metro district to say they want a metro district, then please allow us to create the metro district. We'll charge ourselves additional taxes to finance the construction and maintenance of those amenities. Maybe Harvey Park needs a new swimming pool and the city wasn't willing to finance it. This is all hypothetical, of course, just to kind of explain the idea. So I think that was the idea, was to give an option to people who wanted maybe to have additional amenities, additional infrastructure in their particular neighborhoods. And, you know, obviously they had to get the approval of the people, the existing people who were living there, to say, okay, we'll have a metro district. And then through a democratic process within that metro district, once it was created, to approve higher property taxes to pay back those public improvements. You could hit the next space bar, Christine. And the next one. Here's what I think it's evolved into through loopholes in the law as well as developer manipulation. It's become another profit center. Let me give you another hypothetical example. Let's say that I'm a developer. I have a plot of land. It's totally unimproved, no infrastructure, nothing on it. I decide to go to Denver City Council and say, okay, I would like to have a metro district. What at least our experience has been is they routinely approve these. And then there's no one yet living on the property. Okay, there's no one, the only property owner who's eligible to vote at that election as to whether to decide to create the metro district or not are affiliated with the developer. So the metro district, of course, they're going to say yes. They wanted the metro district in the first place. You'll see there are votes 5-0 because there's only 5 property owners at that time. Yes, we're going to create a metro district. And then they use this as an additional profit center. And in one of the ways that they use it as an additional profit center is that they will actually issue bonds that from a metro district board that they control that are have excessive interest rates on them. And then the developer company itself will buy those bonds that have excessive interest rates on them. So basically, and guess who pays back the bond? It isn't the developer who pays back the bond. It's those future metro district residents who don't yet exist. Okay. All right. Next space bar, please, Christine. When I looked at a picture of this gentleman some time ago, I had no clue who he was. Okay. My guess that very other few people know who he is. He should be recognizable to a lot more people. Next slide, please, Christine. He is this next space bar. He is the same developer executive. This one individual serves on 73 different metro district boards. Of course, next space bar. Of course, he lives in none of those communities. Okay, this is the developer business model now for how you actually do development now in Denver as well as across the state on a dirt district, because this is a much more lucrative way of doing it than the traditional method, which we can get into later. In 2019 and going into 2020, Denver posted an investigative series on this, very extensive and in-depth, multiple articles done on it. And this is a quote from that article. There's so much debt outstanding, they won't ever see it go down. This is from someone who works in what I call the metro district industry. She's a bond attorney. It's about a metro district that's in Castle Rock, just off of I-25. And the developer, without any say or any consent from the residents, has just put layer and layer and layer of debt on residents who have to pay back that debt through higher property taxes. Okay. And this expert is saying she doesn't think they'll ever get from underneath that debt. Okay. Obviously, when you're issuing that much debt, you have to raise property taxes to pay back that debt. We have seen cases where property taxes have gone up astronomically in a very short period of time. One of the ways that what happens at that initial election, let's go back to where we set up the process, where the developer is the only one who's deciding whether there should be a metro district created there or not. Again, you'll see votes 5-0. Yes, we want to create a metro district. At that same election, they will also waive the future Tabor rights of metro district residents. So the board will have complete authority over raising property taxes. The residents have no check through the mechanism of Tabor, which, whether you're a Tabor fan or not, most other Coloradans have that right unless they gave it up from their own free will. Okay, so that's another kind of way done it. And then the other part that this does is that when you increase the cost of housing through what I consider to be often unnecessarily higher property taxes within the metro district, that puts price pressure, obviously upward price pressure on home prices within the metro district, and that can have a gentrification effect on the surrounding neighborhoods as well. So people who are not involved with the development itself or with the metro district itself could also pay a price in terms of having to pay higher property taxes, which could potentially result into some involuntary displacement. Okay, let's do the next slide, Chris. So this is, again, just a thumbnail sketch. So typically what happened, and this is what happened with the Loretto Heights campus, is that the developer will create something called a service plan, which is basically an application that asks the local government, in our case it was Denver City Council, as to whether an election to have a metro district can be conducted. Again, typically these are routinely approved without much scrutiny at all. And they approve these again, with no infrastructure, no houses or residents, they approve these metro districts. That authorizes an election to be conducted. Well, at the time of that election, the only eligible electors, who have to be property owners, are all affiliated with the developer. So of course, everyone affiliated with the developer will say, yes, I want to create a metro district here. And then again, they may pass a bunch of other ballot initiatives at that same time that have long-term implications for the future, for future metro district residents, usually to their detriment. Okay, one of them can be waiving tabor rights, waiving term limits for members who serve on metro district boards. Again, with the notion that it's trying to concentrate all the spending and taxing decisions within the metro district board without any resident consent. This is no small problem statewide. If you could just hit one more space bar, Christine. About 20% of the state's population right now lives within a metro district. This has been basically the development model that's been used to build homes and create infrastructure on dirt districts. Okay, then next slide, Christine. This is another tactic that developers have used, what I like to consider as a manipulation of the law. This is an actual metro district. It's an example. This, again, this same similar model was employed at Loretto Heights. I can't point because I don't think, yeah, I can't point. So if you see there in that yellow box, there is something called District 1. And then you'll see there's Districts 2, 3, and 4. Okay. So this is one large residential development. It's called Lee Farm. It's up in Loveland. One large development, but 4 different metro districts, 4 different kinds of governments. Okay. You'll see that District 1 is a very, very small parcel of land, extremely small. Okay. And then you'll see Districts 2, 3, and 4, which is where real residents will be eventually living. Okay. What happens before any resident sets foot on property, actually purchases has a contract to purchase a home, is that an intergovernmental agreement is set up between District 1 and 2, between District 1 and 3, between District 1 and 4, which makes District 1 the boss. And no residents will ever live in District 1. There may not even be a structure there. Okay, there'll be a metro district board made up of all folks who are affiliated with the developer. Okay, so what that means is that as residents move, for example, as they move into District 2, they are eligible to become members of their District 2 Metro District Board. So let's say that someone takes the bull by the horns, say, I don't really like what's going on with some of the taxing and spending decisions. I'm going to get on my board. Okay, I get on my District 2 Metro District Board, and then I find out I have to obey all the commands from the District 1 Metro District Board, because there's this intergovernmental agreement that had been put in place before I even bought the home that tells me that District 1 Metro District, Metro District Board 1 is the boss. So they say, oh, well, I think that you need to issue some more bonds to do some more infrastructure improvements within District 2. We're ordering you to do that. And as a result, we're going to have to increase your property taxes to pay back those bonds. So even after I become a resident, I become an eligible property owner, I become an eligible elector, I still don't have control over the taxing and spending decisions within my particular metro district. So this has been another tactic that's been used so that the developer can maintain control and basically maintain control of the governance of the entire residential development, including the multiple metro districts that will be included in that large residential development. Space bar, Chris. Next slide, please.
I'm hitting the space bar, so
And it's not working, huh?
let me try the arrow. Let me try to go down.
Page down. Can you try page down?
I don't remember how to do that. Anybody know how the command on a Mac for page down?
It's within PowerPoint.
Oh. I don't know that I can do it.
You were changing slides. Yeah, there it is. You just
Oh.
did it.
Okay,
Just remember that.
I did the space bar.
There you go. Okay. Oh, go. Now we have to go back. You hit the space bar again, I think. Okay. This is also very, very typical. This is actually a loan agreement. Okay. What happens in these kinds of, within this business model, okay, the developer has gone to the city or county, gotten approval to create a metro district. The developer approves it themselves at an election in usually a 5-0 vote. Yes, we're going to create a metro district. Okay. Well, there's still nobody living there, right? And they have to get the infrastructure work started. So they can't charge, since somebody's living there, they can't charge anybody higher, they can't issue a bond because there's no one paying property taxes yet, right? So what they do then is the developer themselves will make a loan to the metro district that they control, okay? So they control the metro district, they make a loan, okay? And then they use the proceeds of that loan to start the infrastructure building process, okay? Now, if you look at this, this is basically a loan agreement. You'll notice that the signature on both sides of the transaction are the same individual. Every time I share this with a lawyer, they go crazy. How can you make an agreement with yourself? Okay. This is a loan agreement between the same person. I don't know how to say that, between the same person. Okay. And with the person in one case is wearing the hat of a Metro District board member, and the other hat that they're wearing is the developer, representative of the developer company. Okay. So here's an incentive, and some of them have taken advantage of this incentive where they can charge an excessive interest rate because there's no negotiation going on here. When I go to the bank for an auto loan, those loans are provided to me on a competitive basis. If I go to one bank and they say, well, we're going to charge you 20% for an auto loan, I'm not going to do business with that bank. But if I go to a different bank who's trying to be competitive, I don't know. Does anybody know what auto loans are going for these days? 4 to 5% maybe, or 3%. I'm going to do business with them. It's a form of negotiation. It's a market price, right? There's no market price here, because how can you have a market price when it's a loan agreement between the same entities? The Metro District Board, controlled by the developer, as well as obviously the developer company itself. Okay. So this is another problem. Those intergovernmental agreements that I talked about earlier, where District 1 becomes the boss of Districts 2, 3, and 4, those two tend to be signed by the same person on both ends of the intergovernmental agreement. So that it's an agreement with oneself. Okay. Hit that space bar again, Christine. Nothing. There. Oh, go ahead. One more. Just the space bar.
I don't know.
There we go. And hit the space bar again, please. It will show us the first bullet. Okay, so the district itself, aside from building and selling homes at a profit, which is a legitimate way of making a living, the district itself has become a significant source of developer profits. We just saw one example of it, where the developer has an opportunity to charge the metro district that they control. They can charge them an excessive rate of interest that eventually will have to be paid back by the metro district residents who don't yet exist. Okay, that's one source of profitability. The other thing they can do, okay, is they can actually issue bonds with an excessive interest rate. They're municipal bonds that are being issued by the Metro District Board that they control, and they turn around and buy those bonds. So they can just, basically, they own those bonds and they just collect excessive rates of interest on them for the life of the bond. And that's another great way to make money, having nothing to do with building and selling homes. Okay, so next space bar, please. The other thing that, anytime any investor is trying to make an investment decision, they have to consider two things. One is, what's the potential rate of return on my investment? And then what's the risk of that investment? I could invest in a business and I hope that the rate of return will be enough to justify the risk of making that investment. One more space bar, Christine. So what happens here in this case is, let's say that let's go back to my hypothetical example where I'm a developer. I'm trying to build 100 homes on this dirt district, okay? I build 10 of those homes, okay? And then the real estate market goes through the floor, and I know I'm not going to be able to sell the remaining 90. In the interim, I had issued a bunch of bonds from that Metro District because I was anticipating building infrastructure from 100 homes, okay? Those bonds are out there. They need to be repaid. But I know that the real estate market now is falling through the floor, and I, the developer, am not on the hook for all that infrastructure financing. Those 10 households that did buy homes from me, they're on the hook for that infrastructure financing, not me. In other parts of the country, if you really want to make this, we sometimes hear the slogan that growth should pay for its own way. One way to make growth pay for its own way is to have the developer actually finance the infrastructure themselves rather than using a governmental entity to do it. And that's the way it's done in most of the rest of the country. There's no reason for developers to do that here because, again, the Metro District has become a profit center unto itself. Sometimes we'll hear the argument, that's why this last bullet is on the slide, oh, we need Metro Districts because we don't have enough access to capital. We can't get the capital on our own. Either we don't have it in our pocket or we don't, a bank won't loan it to us. I don't think that that argument actually passed the smell test, especially for these national developers who are very deep pocketed. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is an actual example. It's from the Loretto Heights campus, and this is a Metro District. You'll see, if you could point to DPS, Christine, where DPS is. This is a $500,000 home. The market is assessed that the home is worth $500,000. It's a hypothetical example. And then a $500,000 home in Denver will pay about a little bit over $1,600 to the school district, about half to the city and county of Denver, and then a small amount to the drainage district, okay? For a total of almost $2,600 in property taxes. Now, in the Metro home column, okay, they pay all those same home taxes. I'm sorry, they pay all those same property taxes, okay? So they pay the same amount to the school district, Denver, as well as the sewage district, okay? But they also pay taxes to pay back the bonds of the Metro District, to pay for the operations administration of the Metro District, and to pay what is called a regional levy, which we can get into if you have questions about that. These amounts have actually come from, this is what the developer on the campus of Loretto Heights now is authorized to charge in property taxes to future Metro District residents of the Loretto Heights campus, okay? They are on the Metro District Board, and they have the authority that was given to them by City Council, again, what is usually a routine approval process. They can charge those additional property taxes on those Metro District residents that will be moving into the Loretto Heights campus. The real point of this slide is to show that it's basically doubling their property taxes, okay? A huge increase. This obviously, the cities across the state are grappling with affordability issues. Paying higher property taxes obviously is not contributing to making homes more affordable, Okay, next slide, please, Christine. So again, just to repeat, residents, so they're non-existent when the district was first created up. So that when the district is being created up, all those decisions are being made in the interest of the developer, not the future residents, okay? Only the developer's people get to vote. Some of this is in fact disclosed to the prospective home buyer at closing, okay? That, you know, you'll be paying approximately this much more in property taxes, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, and you know, we can have philosophical arguments about this, most people don't read every piece of paper that they sign at closing. I have a degree in finance, and I didn't do it when I purchased my home. I'll confess to. And fortunately, my home was not in a metro district, so I didn't have any unpleasant surprises down the road, seeing my property taxes skyrocket without me having any say. And obviously, after a metro district resident buys a home within the metro district, they're locked in, okay? There's really very little recourse other than for to turn around and sell their home. So they're kind of locked in. They have very little recourse at that point about what to do in their situation. I know if I was a metro district resident, I looked at my property tax bill, the first one I got, and I said, boy, this is a lot higher than I had anticipated. Probably the first call I would make would be to my local city council person. My local city council person would say, I can speak to the taxes that go to the city and county of Denver, but I cannot speak to the taxes that go to the metro district. You're going to have to go to the metro district board to address any concerns that you have about those particular taxes. Well, then I go to the Metro District Board, and guess what? I find out that the Metro District Board is not my fellow residents. It's totally populated by people who are affiliated with the developer, representing the interests of the developer, not representing my interests, okay? The other thing that I found out, much to my surprise, is that unlike most Coloradans and the rest of the state, if I feel like my local government, or even state government for that matter, is being unresponsive, I can bypass that government and go to the ballot, put something on the ballot as an initiative if I collect enough qualified signatures. And then if I get a majority of people to agree with my initiative, then that becomes the law, okay? So I don't have that option as a metro district. Metro district residents do not have the option to go and put ballot initiatives on their metro district election ballots, okay? They're obviously voiceless and unaware of, prior slide, okay, voiceless and unaware. They don't know what a metro district is. I mean, how many people do? Even the people who live within them don't understand how they work. They don't even know that there's a board. They can initially have low property taxes, but then boom, they can be increased instantly, or as we saw in one case, it was increased 5 times just within a span of about 20 years. I'm sorry, within a span of 2 years. Okay, next slide. They do have periodic elections, but they tend, again, because people are unaware, they tend to be frequently canceled because there may be 2 open slots on the Metro District Board. Usually there's 5 or 7 seats. There's 2 open slots. The only people who offer themselves as candidates to serve on the Metro District Board are affiliated with the developer. And so that election gets canceled and the developer gets to maintain control over time, okay? The other thing that's happened, and this actually happened up in Green Valley Ranch right here in Denver, is that some residents who became aware of what had been occurring within their Metro District and their property taxes going through the roof, is they decided to get active. So they offered themselves as candidates to serve on their Metro District boards. The developer got wind of this, sought out other more developer-friendly residents, okay, and financed their campaigns to serve on the Metro District Board. In the case of Green Valley Ranch, by the way, there are no contribution limits on candidates for Metro District boards. In the case of Green Valley Ranch, Pat Hamill, who's the CEO, provided $40,000 in a very, low-level kind of election, whether it's maybe a few hundred votes, to 2 candidates. You can guess who won that election, and the residents who were asking uncomfortable questions of the developer did not prevail in those elections. So they can tip the scale towards residents that they consider to be more friendly to their the developer's interests. very little transparency. Even though city councils and counties across the state have the ability to exercise oversight, they usually just wash their hands of it after the Metro District election creation election has been approved. Folks have a hard time getting reliable financial information, how the debt is spent, whether it was what it was spent on, whether it was spent cost effectively is like pulling teeth. This is example after example of this. The developer really has no incentive to be transparent with the Metro District residents. And we've also seen cases of this. This is very unfortunate. There's been a cottage industry that has kind of developed around this business model. You have special people who specialize in managing developer-controlled Metro districts. You have accountants who do this work for developer-controlled Metro districts, and so on and so forth, bond attorneys and so forth. We've seen many instances of vendor overpayment because it's the Metro District Board that's deciding how to pay these vendors. The Metro District Board, mind you, is being controlled by the developer. The Metro District, that same Metro District Board is not spending the developer's money, they're spending the Metro District residents' money, and they don't have much incentive to negotiate a fair price with a vendor, okay? And then these basically, this is my term, these are private governments. A private interest is governing with the same powers that a local government has. They can in-debt and tax residents without really any real democratic accountability, put liens on private property, so on and so forth. And so it becomes, something in a country that was founded on limited government. This is unlimited government with a private industry basically making a private company making all the calls. Next slide, please, Kristen. This is a Google map, and you'll see the perforated, the line, that the dotted line, that is the campus of Loretta Heights. Just for frame of reference, that's the intersection of South Federal Boulevard and West Dartmouth Avenue. And then you'll see that outer blue line, that's all the surrounding neighborhoods. This is just to make the point that because there's going to be higher property taxes put on the Metro District, which is the Loretta Heights campus, that's going to put upward price pressure on the homes within the Metro District, and that could have a gentrification impact on the surrounding neighborhoods. At least by Denver standards, the neighborhood to the east of Federal Boulevard there, which is College View, is somewhat affordable, again, by Denver standards. But we're afraid that there's going to be some gentrification there because of the Loretta Heights campus development itself. Property taxes are going to go up in College View, and those folks who had nothing to do with the development, as well as the Metro District, may pay a price through involuntary displacement. Okay, next slide, and it's our last slide. These are some of the policy goals. We actually do have a bill that's in the legislature now. It's going to be up for a hearing on Tuesday. Take some very small steps to get to these longer term goals. I think we're asking for, these are pretty reasonable requests. We'd like Metro District residents to be the ones who serve on their Metro District boards, not folks affiliated with the developer. We'd like Metro District residents to have the same rights as almost every other Coloradan. They can put citizen initiatives on their local government ballots. And this is coming, I will confess, I am not a fan of Tabor, but in this case, it is a strange bedfellow for me, because I'd like, in this case, in this situation, I'd like these people to have Tabor rights so that they can serve as a check and balance on that developer-controlled Metro District board. There's been a lot of questions about how independent the audits of the Metro Districts are, because again, there's been an industry that's kind of grown up around this business model, and there's just one or two auditors, I don't know about one or two, but just a few auditors that do this kind of work, and they're very, very close to the developer, so we're not sure how independent those audits are. We'd like the legislature to take a look at this, take a step back, look at the big picture. Is this really the best way to finance infrastructure on these dirt districts across the state? Is it a cost-effective way of financing infrastructure on dirt districts? And fortunately, we have one municipality within the state. Go back, Christine.
Sorry.
That's okay. We have one municipality within the state, Longmont, which has decided as a policy, which any other municipality in Colorado can do if they wish, we're not going to use metro, because of many of the abuses that I've just outlined, we're not going to use metro districts for residential developments. There's just too many abuses. We're not going to do it. The developer is going to have to find different ways of financing the infrastructure other than through a metro district within the city, the boundaries of the city of Longmont. And the experience there is that, because we know that this will probably be a scare tactic, that we'll hear, oh my gosh, we have a housing shortage. We're not going to be able to build homes unless we have these things called metro districts. That has not at all been the case with Longmont. There are other stronger factors that are still going to drive the construction of additional residential units within the state. And then within the notion of if you're in a hole, the first thing you should do is stop digging. We have problems with these metro districts as it is. This is going to take decades to unravel. Please don't create any new problems. Don't create any new metro districts until we get a handle on this issue. And that is my presentation. I'm sure there are some questions that I'm more than happy to.
Okay, I couldn't see anything during that time, so now I see there's a bunch of questions. But I know some of you think, oh, this doesn't apply to me. I live in the city, but I want you to know there are two very important districts, West Globeville 1 and West Globeville 2, that nobody knows about, that were created in 2016 and are now being used on that Fox Island development. The same guy who runs Pure Development is the major elector on that. So it is applicable. There's a couple here on Lowry. They do exist in Denver. So it looks like there's a bunch. Lou, let's see, Lou and Bruce and Bill Tanner. Wow, Lou, do you want to just ask your question or do you want me to read them all? I don't mind reading them. Okay. But each entity for which the person is signing is in fact a separate legal entity. So it's not the same entity. Signing by the same person, I guess she's referring to that document, is not the same thing as being the same entity or person. The entities are different with different boards and legal structures. I guess I see that. That's technically maybe correct, but I also see your point, Jim.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name of the person who asked the question, but
Lou Raiders.
yeah, you're right about that, Lou. They have two different hats on, but it is still the same person. And there's no negotiation going on about what the interest rate should be on that loan. Why if I can charge a higher interest rate and I get to be the decision maker who decides whether to accept that loan with that high interest rate, I'm the same person and I'm not the one paying it back. I'm going to charge you I have every incentive to charge you a high interest rate. And they typically do.
And then there's a follow-up from Bill Tanner. If the deep-pocketed developer funds the infrastructure, how does the developer recoup that cost? Wouldn't that be through higher home prices? That is, the money is never really free to the ultimate owner or beneficiary. So the key question is, are costs higher through the metro district model or or the developer privately funding the model?
That's a really good question. The way it's done in most of the rest of the country, and in a way that I think is much more transparent to the prospective home buyer, is the developer will buy the land like they do here. Then they either go to a bank or they use their own money to build the infrastructure within the dirt district that they purchased. And then they build the cost of that infrastructure into the price of the home. Okay. And that way, if I'm a homeowner, there's nothing invisible about it. This is the price of the home, this newly built home. There's nothing invisible. It's very transparent. This is how much the home is going to cost. And then I get to see what amenities are going to be provided along with that home, which would otherwise be provided by that metro district. But if the developer put in a pool or tennis courts or whatever, all of that will be baked into the price of the home. Okay. And then I can decide whether I want to buy that whole package or not. Right now, when a metro district resident is approaching, considering whether to buy a home in a metro district, there's a lot of kind of shell games that are being played. Again, they technically sign off on a disclosure form that I honestly don't think the majority of them understand what they're signing, which basically says that you don't really have any say in what additional taxes that you're going to be paying down the road. And a lot of invisible costs without any transparency or without any sort of market discipline going on is being exercised. I believe once we conduct an analysis, I believe that homes being built within the metro districts as they are would be more expensive than they otherwise would be if they were built the traditional way, where the developer gets a loan from a bank or uses their own money to build infrastructure and bills the cost of the infrastructure into the price of each home.
Okay, Bill, did you want to follow up by saying anything here?
Sure, I think that's a good answer. It just really gets down to how you finance these infrastructure costs and how clearly presented those infrastructure costs are. I think your proposals at the end for the elected governments to consider are worth considering. If I get a copy of your presentation, I'll send it to some elected officials, just as an added voice, suggesting that they pay attention to this concern. And of course, I agree with you that transparency ought to be very high. The lack of transparency in these deals is I think, really a key part of the issue. People should understand what they're getting into, and if they're getting, for instance, a lower home price to begin with, because the funding comes through the district, they ought to understand that the stream of costs going out in the future, the net present value of that stream, actually may cause their house price to be higher, and that at least ought to be stated on the form, so that they understand, because a lot of people don't understand the net present value of future cash flows. And if that were stated, I think it would help people make a better decision about the purchase that they're going to make. And that's really, I think that's the concern about the whole thing. To me, it's not necessarily the process or having metro districts being good or bad. It's that what's happening is, to your point, is that they allow people in the end to make bad decisions because people are not really financially literate when it comes to how these costs are there. And the other bad aspect, which I think you pointed out, is that it takes away the ability of future residents to actually participate in the democratic process, which I'm strongly opposed to. I think that people should have a strong role in the democratic process, and that should not be subverted by anybody for a particular individual's or entity's benefit, as opposed to the population that inhabits the particular area. So I think I would focus on those two issues. And when you present this to the government, I think I would have a summary of those two issues, points that we can all agree on, because I don't think they can disagree with that. I think in your presentation, you come out with a good suggestion at the end, but I think up front you ought to say, hey, here's what I'm trying to achieve. Do you agree with these policy objectives? Yes or no? Maybe not as blunt as that, but I think the people who are reviewing your presentation would agree up front that these are the good policy objectives to pursue, and then leave it open to them how they decide to pursue it. I mean, they could continue with these metro districts, but what you would essentially provide a better solution by including the clarity and the around actual costs and removing the ability of the developer to in perpetuity control decisions in the metro district without the residents having any control over those at all. So I think those are two key points.
Thanks,
Jim,
Bill.
I'm wondering if you could put in the chat, if you want, that email for people to get your newsletter on metro districts, because that would be great if you would type it in the chat. And can I make my little political point about, which is a bigger city issue? I am very upset at several metro districts which have been granted by city council ahead of zoning. And I have some examples. I'll try not to talk too long, but in other words, the city goes, oh, that sounds wonderful. We won't have to worry about infrastructure. You guys are great. I know it. I watched a hearing the other day, an old hearing, in which the council did ask, how much will a single family owner have to pay in additional taxes? And they calculated it, and it was huge. I can't remember this second. And then they also asked about some facilities fee, and it turns out single family owners would have to pay a $3,000 facility fee, and renters would have to pay a $1,500 facility fee. This was 8 years ago, and the development's not done yet, and it's changed hands, and all these great smooth speakers at city council have disappeared, sold the property, transferred the ownership of the metro district, and it's being run by the same person who's running the development. And this is in Globeville. This isn't an area that needs affordable housing. And I have a feeling nobody has any idea of the fact that putting the cart before the horse and approving metro districts is giving a blank slate, is giving a blank check to developers to do whatever they want for the next decade. And it is virtually guaranteeing zoning. And I've seen that here on Lowry, where it happened, even though land was contaminated, still hasn't been built on because of a federal government, but they still have the metro district, and the lobbyists are still serving. That was in 2008. The same lobbyists are still serving as directors. So I think this is a bigger problem than only a problem for the residents who move in. Do you see where I'm going, Jim? I feel bad for the residents who move in and have no idea they're going to pay an additional $5,000 in taxes. But I also feel that it sort of takes us out of the equation in terms of input, because the district's already been approved by council. Doesn't matter what we say on zoning.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Christine, is that, for example, the city of Westminster, there is a new development, it's called Uplands. I think it's between Lowell and Federal and 84th and 88th. It's an old farm that's now being redeveloped. And the developer wanted to put a metro district there before the property had been rezoned, okay? This was rezoned for agriculture, all right? Well, Westminster actually has a policy that says we don't approve new metro districts until, if there's going to be rezoning of it, we don't approve until that rezoning has been approved. So there is a precedent to have a city policy in place that says a metro district should come after rezoning has been approved, not before. In the case, for example, in Loretta Heights, they approved the metro district prior to the approval of the rezoning of the campus. And I think to some, it does kind of build the case. Well, you say, well, this thing is already we already have a governmental structure in place that's going to, make different use of this land. Yeah, sure, you should approve the rezoning now. That seems to have it backwards. Metro districts are only a means of financing and operating infrastructure. They have nothing to say about land use. Does that make sense, Chris? Or?
It makes sense to me. I've just seen it abused, and watching what's going on in Globeville and Sunnyside right now, it's making me kind of crazy, but I don't live there and they don't want my opinion, so.
Just one other thing I wanted to mention, because it's been in the news recently. I'm assuming folks on this call have heard about the foreclosures that are occurring in Green Valley Ranch as a result of the homeowner associations. I guess they're saying that they've been violating their covenants. And so they're And once, if the HOA determines that the homeowner hasn't complied, they will foreclose on the property. This can be very, very confusing to a regular homeowner, but HOAs are much different than metro districts. One of the reasons they get confused about the two and they conflate the two is that often metro districts will enforce the covenants of HOAs. Okay, which I think I also think as a matter of policy is inappropriate. I don't think government should be, a local government should be in the business of enforcing a private covenant. Okay, in fact, this bill that's going to be heard on Tuesday, should it pass, will prohibit future metro districts from enforcing future covenants. So that's another aspect of this. So the metro district, in the case of Green Valley Ranches, they're not the culprit behind those foreclosures, if that's the way you're looking at it. They're merely enforcing the covenants of the HOAs that are up in the Green Valley Ranch development, which I think is inappropriate. I don't think they should be in that business.
Oh, it's literally a lot of food for thought. I'm shocked at how many we have. If anybody's interested, just put in DOLA, Department of Local Affairs, metro districts, and there's thousands of them in Colorado. Did you say in the beginning how many exactly?
It's a quarter, what was I say, a quarter? About a fifth of the state's population now lives within a metro district.
Yeah. And the amount of debt that can be issued is huge.
Yes.
20 million can be issued on the Globeville project.
Basically, if there's a dirt district, no infrastructure, the business model now in Colorado is the developer will put a metro district, will apply to try to get a metro district on that dirt district because they have found it to be very lucrative profitably. And that's just the business model that's being used right now.
Yeah, I'm worried about our planning department, the whole way the city does planning. And, they'll say, well, we have to do a neighborhood plan and we have to do the metro district because it saves us money. And then by the time then the zoning has to comply with the plan that was just done, even though the plan was done by a developer in order to get a specific result. There's no equity there at all. And I don't think residents are focused on that. So anyway, are there other questions or comments? We have a few more minutes, 3 more minutes.
I have a question, Chris.
Okay, Gertie.
This may be too Pollyanna-ish, but are there any good metro districts? Like, I think South Suburban Parks and Recreation is a metro district, and my son lives there, and I'm just curious to see how big a sucker he was.
I don't think he was a sucker. That is a park and recreation district. That's a different type of special district. Metro districts are just one type of special district. And what separates metro districts from other different types of special districts is that they can provide multiple different services. Okay. So in the case of, you said your son is living in the South Suburban?
South Suburban Parks and Rec.
The taxes that he's paying, that's only going to parks and recreational purposes. He's not paying any additional infrastructure or anything like that. He's just paying probably, they obviously had to do some infrastructure work for the parks, but he's probably not paying that much additional property taxes just to build and maintain the park system there.
But are there any good metro districts like the ones that you described, or any that are functioning and allowing property owners to participate in the decisions about what kind of loans or bonds are going to be issued?
Unfortunately, it's more the exception than the rule. I did an analysis of all the board members for the whole state. This was information provided by the Department of Local Affairs. I looked at, and I made an assumption when I did this analysis. The analysis was that if someone is affiliated with the developer and they're serving on a metro district board, they are representing the interest of the developer. They're not representing the interest of the residents. Okay, that's one assumption I made. The other assumption I made is that when I sorted that list that I got from the Department of Local Affairs, if I saw a person who occupied the same person occupied 2 or more seats, I assumed, because we don't have specific data with the Department of Local Affairs, I assumed that they were affiliated with the developer, okay? And that they weren't living in the community. I might actually be missing some there. I think it's a fairly conservative estimate. So to answer your question, based on that analysis, almost 2/3 of Metro District board members across the state are affiliated with the developer, not the residents, okay? A little bit less than a quarter are actual residents, and a little bit less than a quarter are vacant. I'm hoping I answered your question, Gertie.
Yes, thank you. Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay.
And you can leave things vacant. You can leave spots vacant and have one person on the board. There's no requirement to fill them.
I think technically there isn't a requirement, but most of them have every incentive to fill them because they want to develop the lot. They want to develop the subdivision. I can take another example. For example, right here in Denver, Green Valley Ranch, which I had mentioned earlier. Initially, they broke ground on that, I think in the early to mid 80s, okay? To this day, the developer is still making governance decisions up there. To this day, what is that, almost 40 years? I don't think this is what the legislature intended. I think that the fellow Metro District residents should be making the taxing and spending decisions there, not people affiliated with the developer.
Is there any other comments? Otherwise, we can wrap up. Well, thank you, Jim, for coming today.
Thanks for
Did
having
you,
me.
I forget if you would like us, is Tuesday the committee vote or is Tuesday the legislature vote?
The bill is up in committee on Tuesday. It's 1:30 before the House, 1:30 p.m. in the House Transportation and Local Government Committee. And it's again a very small step to start unraveling this problem.
The Transportation and what committee?
The House Transportation and Local Government Committee.
Okay, so we can probably watch it if we want. Okay.
Yes. And I did put
Okay.
my email in the chat room if anybody would like to contact me with any follow-up questions or comments.
Or to get on your email list for your Metro District newsletter, which is very good, by the way.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
Bye.
Bye.